Hi again. I'd like to continue talking about CSS Grid, and in this video I'd like to talk about template areas and using the areas to name locations on your grid layout, right? Okay, so in the last couple videos I kind of built a simple layout here with a header and some main area and a sidebar and a footer, and this worked pretty good, but I had to be kind of verbose in describing where everything goes, and sometimes that's useful and it's good, but actually CSS Grid gives us another way of describing where things fit in the grid, and this is actually kind of a really interesting feature. It's called grid areas. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to add a new property to the container. So what we're going to do is we're going to set up some template areas. Okay, so these are going to be named row, column, areas on the grid that are defined in the grid container. And then what we'll do is we'll assign elements down here to those locations. Okay, so I'm going to choose grid template areas. And it's kind of nice if you can lay these out or write them as, something like this. Like I have header, sidebar, main, footer, and login. So let's use the first letter. We could spell out the names, but they're different lengths, and so when we type them in here, you'll see that it'll be hard to read. So what I'm going to do is just use the first letter. So the header will be H, the sidebar will be S, main will be M, footer will be F, and login will be L. So what I'd like to do is I'm going to use a string here inside, or the quotation marks around this. So really what I have here, if I broke this up into columns, I would have 2 columns of H and 1 column of L, right? Because I have 3 units here going across. There's 3 grid columns, right? And if you had more columns, you could add more letters here, okay, or more names. Okay, now you'll see where the quotation marks come in. If I break this up onto multiple lines, they have to be quoted, okay? And don't put the semicolon yet. We'll put the semicolon at the very end, right? So imagine that this was the first row across here, and then this will be the second row. So sidebar is our first column, and then main takes up the next 2 columns, okay? And then our next one will be another sidebar and another row of main, right? Or another 2 columns of main. Okay? And then if I move this over a little bit here like that, and then I say the bottom one is going to be footer, footer, and footer. So in a lot of ways, like I've just described everything that I have here, but with letters. And I've written them in a grid. You could actually just line these up. I think you can write these a lot of different ways, but this is kind of the easiest way for me to understand it. So I just wrote it here to kind of describe the grid locations. And I find if I just use a single letter for each of these, it's really easy to read this, right? So it's header, header, login, sidebar, main, main, sidebar, main, main, and footer, okay? So now what we'd like to do is we'd like to get rid of all this stuff and use grid area down here. So for login, I'm going to give this a grid area name of L. Okay, and then for footer, we'll give this a grid area name of F. And then for main, we'll give this a grid area name of M. And then for sidebar, we'll give it a grid area of S. And for header, this will be grid area of H. Okay, so there we go. And this, it's not very exciting because it looks exactly the same as it did before, but actually right now we've described how we want to lay things out on the grid here by name, and then we've placed the name on an element, and that makes, the code for each of these elements very succinct and very easy to read, right? So this sits in area L up here, and this sits in area F down here, etc. And then the template areas, when I read this as a grid, it kind of describes exactly what's going on the grid here. Okay. So anyway, thanks for watching. I hope that's useful to you in your projects that you're making.